Gerald Fitch didn't even have the decency to face her himself. He sent his housekeeper, a pinched, bird-like woman named Mrs. Crane, to meet Evelyn Ashcroft at the station platform with a folded note and a look of barely concealed satisfaction. Evelyn stood there in her traveling dress, her single trunk at her feet, the Wyoming wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, and she watched Mrs. Crane press that note into her hand the way someone might drop a coin to a beggar. Not a word spoken, just a thin smile, a short nod, and then the woman turned and walked back toward the wagon without ever once looking back. Evelyn unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Gerald's. She recognized it from his letters, those careful, courteous letters that had convinced her to sell her furniture, pack her grandmother's quilt, and board a train west. The note said 4 sentences. He had reconsidered. The arrangement was no longer suitable. She should make other arrangements. He wished her well. 4 sentences. After 4 months of letters and every cent she owned, if you've never stood in a strange town with no money, no return ticket, and 30 pairs of eyes watching you read the worst news of your life, then you cannot imagine what Evelyn Ashcroft felt on that platform. And if you want to know what happened next, what one feared and battle-scarred rancher said that stunned every soul in Red Hollow into silence, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that platform, because what happens in the next few minutes is going to change everything. The train had already pulled away. Evelyn stood there long enough that the sound of it faded completely. That long, mournful shriek of the whistle disappearing into the hills, and still she didn't move. The note was in her hand. She read it twice, not because she misunderstood it, but because some part of her kept insisting she must have. 4 months. She had written to Gerald Fitch for 4 months, answered every question he asked, told him about her life in Cincinnati, about her mother's passing, about the small seamstress work she had been doing to stay afloat after her father's debts swallowed everything they owned. She had been honest with him. She had been careful. She had not been foolish. And yet here she stood. The platform was not crowded, but it was crowded enough. A group of men leaning against the feed store across the street had stopped talking. 2 women in front of the dry goods shop were whispering behind gloved hands. A boy of maybe 12 sat on the water trough staring at her openly, the way children do when they haven't yet learned to pretend they're not looking. Evelyn folded the note. She pressed it flat against her palm once, deliberately, and then she tucked it into the pocket of her dress. She would not cry here. She had decided that in the 3 seconds between reading the last sentence and folding the paper, she would not give this town that. What she would do next, she had absolutely no idea. Her trunk held 3 dresses, her grandmother's quilt, a small tin of sewing supplies, a book of poetry she had carried since she was 16, and $42, which had seemed like a reasonable amount to arrive with before she understood she would be arriving alone. The Hotel Larimer on the main street had a hand-painted sign in the window advertising rooms at $2 a night. She did the arithmetic automatically, the way women who have always had to manage money do without thinking. 21 nights. Then nothing. She picked up the handle of her trunk and began pulling it toward the street. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe her arms were just tired from the journey. 3 days on the train. 1 long layover in Denver where she had eaten half a sandwich to save money and spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the station because the women's waiting room was full. She had arrived in Red Hollow, Wyoming, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, 1881, and the sky above the main street was a hard, brilliant blue that felt almost cruel for how beautiful it was. "That's her," she heard one of the women say, not quietly. Evelyn kept walking. The wheels of her trunk caught on the edge of a loose plank, and the whole thing tilted. She wrenched it upright, the effort jarring her shoulder, and she kept her face perfectly still. 1 foot, then the other. That was the whole plan right now. 1 foot, then the other, until she reached the hotel and could close a door behind her and sit down somewhere that wasn't a public street. She was 3 steps from the boardwalk when the voice stopped her. "Miss Ashcroft?" She turned. The man standing in the doorway of the general store was not Gerald Fitch. She had seen the one photograph Fitch had enclosed with his 3rd letter. A round-faced man in his 50s with a careful mustache and the look of someone who had never been entirely comfortable being photographed. This man was nothing like that. I was brought across the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the cut of his coat, and the coat itself was plain, working canvas, not a gentleman's wool. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that had probably been broken at least once from the set of it, and a scar that ran from his left cheekbone toward his ear. Not fresh, old, the kind of thing a man has carried so long he stops noticing other people notice it. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not curiosity, exactly. Something more careful than either of those. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, because she didn't know what else to say. "Do I know you?" "No," he said. "Rowan Blackridge. I run the Blackridge Ranch north of town." He came down the 2 steps from the store entrance without any particular hurry. "I was standing inside when Crane delivered that note." Evelyn went very still. "I didn't read it," he said quickly, and his voice was low, even, the kind of voice that didn't feel the need to rush. "I heard enough from the conversation she was having with Hattie Pruitt before you got off the train. The whole store heard it." He stopped about 5 feet from her, and he did not look at her trunk or her coat or any of the things people had been looking at since she stepped onto the platform. He looked at her face. "Gerald Fitch is a coward and a fool, and most people in this town know it. That doesn't fix your situation, but I thought you should know it wasn't something you did." Evelyn stared at him. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Blackridge," she said, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "But I'm not sure what you expect me to do with that information." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. "Nothing," he said. "I don't expect you to do anything with it." He was quiet for a moment, and she got the sense he was choosing his next words with some care. "I do have a proposition, though, and I want to be clear it is a business proposition, not anything else, so you don't have to look at me like I'm the second disaster of your morning." Despite everything, she almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. "My ranch cook left 3 weeks ago," Rowan said. "Took a wife in Cheyenne and didn't come back. I've got 8 ranch hands eating whatever they can manage to throw together, and it is not going well for anyone. I need someone who can manage a household, cooking, supplies, basic organization. The work is real, and it is not easy, but the wage is fair, the room has a door with a lock, and nobody on my property will bother you." He paused. "That's the whole offer. You can say no." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The women by the dry goods shop had stopped pretending not to watch. The men by the feed store had shifted so they were facing her direction more directly. The boy on the water trough had his mouth slightly open. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she said. "You don't," Rowan said. "Not yet. But you can ask anyone in town what my reputation is, and they'll tell you I'm difficult to work for and I keep my word. Both of those things are true." He glanced briefly at the women across the street, then back at her. "I'd rather you make an informed decision than a desperate one, so take your time." "I don't have a great deal of time to take," Evelyn said. "That appears to be the situation." "I know." She looked down at her trunk for just a moment, then back up at him. "What does fair mean when you say a fair wage? $12 a month, room and board included." She did the arithmetic again. $12 a month on top of not paying for food or lodging was $12 a month she could save. In 8 months, she would have nearly $100. In a year, she might have enough to do something. She didn't know what yet, but something that was hers. "All right," she said, "I accept your offer." She said it before she could think herself out of it, which was probably the right instinct. Rowan nodded once, like she had told him something practical and unsurprising. He reached down and picked up the handle of her trunk in one hand and started toward the end of the street where a wagon and 2 horses waited. "We'll stop at the hotel so you can freshen up if you need to," he said. "Ride north takes about 40 minutes. Evelyn followed him. Behind her, she could already hear the murmuring start up again. Lower now, more deliberate. She caught 2 words clearly from the cluster near the dry goods shop. Not charitable words. She kept walking. Whatever Red Hollow thought of Evelyn Ashcroft in that moment, she had already decided it was not her primary concern. She would prove things with time. She had always done it that way. Whoop. The road north out of Red Hollow ran along a shallow creek for the first mile, and then it climbed. The hills rolled out in every direction with the kind of scale that takes some getting used to when you've spent your whole life in a city. Not threatening exactly, but insistent, the way the landscape keeps insisting that you are smaller than you think you are. Evelyn sat on the wagon bench beside Rowan and watched the hills and said very little, which suited both of them, apparently. He asked her once if she was warm enough. She said she was. He told her the ranch had been in his family for 20 years, that his father had homesteaded it, and that he had taken it over after his parents died, his mother first, his father 2 years later, and that it currently ran about 300 head of cattle and employed 8 men year-round and several more during calving season. He said all of this in the same even, practical tone he'd used on the platform, like he was briefing a business associate. Evelyn listened and watched the countryside and thought, this could be worse. She wasn't sure yet if it was good, but it could be considerably worse. The ranch house came into view around a bend in the road, and her first impression was that it was large and that someone had once cared about it and had stopped caring some time ago. The main house was 2 stories, solid timber construction, a wide porch running across the front. The porch railing needed paint. One of the shutters on the upper left window had a hinge problem and hung at an angle. The yard between the house and the barn had been functional once. She could see the outline of where a kitchen garden had been, but it had gone to weeds and packed dirt. The barn itself was in better shape than the house. She noticed that. 2 of the ranch hands came out of the barn when the wagon pulled in, and they stopped when they saw her. One was young, maybe 20, with a sunburned neck and the expression of someone who had just been caught doing something he shouldn't have been. The other was older, heavy-set, with a dark beard and the careful stillness of a man who made a habit of watching before he reacted. "This is Miss Ashcroft," Rowan said, climbing down from the wagon. "She'll be managing the household. Show her the same respect you show me." The young one, she would learn his name was Tommy Briggs, pulled off his hat so fast he nearly dropped it. "Yes, sir, Mr. Blackridge, ma'am." The older one, whose name was Dutch Carver, studied her for a moment with eyes that were neither warm nor hostile, just assessing. He nodded once. "Ma'am." Then he went back to whatever he'd been doing. Rowan showed her the kitchen first. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, and kept her expression neutral with some effort. It was not a disaster exactly, but it had the look of a place where men had been managing alone for 3 weeks, and managing was doing generous work. The wood stove needed cleaning. There were dishes stacked in a way that suggested they had been washed at some point, but not recently. A cast iron pot on the back burner had something in it that had been there long enough to require investigation she was not prepared to do today. "I'll need supplies," she said. "I know. I'll get you a list of what's in the storeroom and what needs to come from town. We go in every 2 weeks." 2 weeks?" she repeated. "That'll change if there's something that can't wait." She turned and looked at him directly. "Do I have authority to direct the household as I see fit, or will every decision need your approval?" He looked slightly surprised, like the question had come from a direction he hadn't expected. "As long as it doesn't affect the ranch operations, you run the house. That's what I'm paying you for." "Good," she said. "Then I'll start with that pot." He looked at the pot. Something crossed his face that she suspected was relief. "I'll leave you to it." He was already heading toward the door when she said, "Mr. Blackridge." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did on the platform. You didn't have to do that." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I didn't." And then he went outside. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen of a stranger's house in a state she had never been to before, with the wind moving through a gap somewhere under the back door, and a pot of something alarming on the stove, and $42 in her pocket that she would not need to spend for at least a while. She rolled up her sleeves. The first 3 days told her most of what she needed to know about the ranch, and the knowledge was complicated. The ranch hands, all 8 of them by the end of the first week when she had managed to get them all in the same room at meal times, were not bad men. They were tired men, and they had been eating badly for 3 weeks, and that combination had made them short-tempered in the specific way that people get short-tempered when no one has been taking care of basic things. Tommy Briggs was eager to help and got underfoot. Dutch Carver did exactly what was asked of him, and nothing more, and watched her with those careful eyes that she decided, eventually, meant he was still deciding about her rather than that he'd already decided against her. A man named Hector kept a small garden behind the bunkhouse that she hadn't noticed until the 3rd day, herbs and late-season squash. And when she asked him about it, he looked defensive, like she was going to make him pull it up. She asked him if he'd be willing to expand it in the spring, He stared at her. Then he said he supposed he might be. Rowan she saw at meals and occasionally passing through the yard. He ate what she cooked without comment, which she took as a compliment because he was clearly not a man who performed gratitude he didn't feel. On the fourth morning, she found a list on the kitchen table, handwritten in his spare angular script. Supplies they needed, organized by priority, with approximate costs beside each item. She had not asked for the costs. He had included them anyway because he understood, without being told, that she would want to know how to manage the budget. She stood at the kitchen table holding that list for longer than she meant to. It was a small thing, but small things, she had learned, told you more about a person than the large ones. The situation in town was less straightforward. She learned about it in pieces, the way you always learn things you weren't meant to know. Tommy Briggs had a loose relationship with silence, and over the course of the first week she gathered the following. That Gerald Fitch had, in fact, been telling people in Red Hollow for some time that he was expecting a mail-order bride, and that this had been met with a combination of interest and mild ridicule, because apparently Gerald Fitch was known for making plans that didn't materialize. That when Evelyn had stepped off the train and been publicly dismissed, the general reaction in town had been a kind of schadenfreude. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The way communities sometimes treat other people's embarrassments like entertainment they didn't have to pay for. That Rowan Blackridge offering her work had caused a different kind of talk entirely, because Rowan was not known for involving himself in other people's situations, and people were still trying to work out what it meant. And that Gerald Fitch, specifically, had made a comment in the saloon 3 days after she arrived at the ranch that she was not supposed to hear about but did anyway, because Tommy Briggs had been in the saloon that evening, and Tommy Briggs was constitutionally incapable of keeping anything to himself. He said, Tommy told her, clearly uncomfortable with the telling but unable to stop himself, that Rowan had always been good at picking up other men's cast-offs. Evelyn was cutting carrots at the time. She kept cutting. Miss Ashcroft, Tommy said. I heard you, Tommy. I probably shouldn't have said it. Probably not. She set down the knife and turned to look at him. He was 19, she had decided, possibly 20, with the look of someone who had grown up fast in some ways, and not at all in others. Did anyone say anything back to him? Tommy's ears went red. Dutch told him to shut his mouth. Something in Evelyn settled slightly. Good, she said. She picked up the knife again. Tell Dutch I appreciate it. You could tell him yourself. I could, she agreed, but it'll mean more coming from you. She glanced at him sidelong. Go on. Get the firewood before it gets dark. He went. The kitchen garden she decided to restore was the first real project she claimed as her own. It was overgrown beyond saving in the short run, but she cleared the worst of it on a Saturday afternoon when the regular work was done, pulling up dead growth by hand, working around the edges where the soil still looked good. Hector came by around 4 o'clock, saw what she was doing, and without a word picked up the other edge of the garden and started working alongside her. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, which suited her fine. Good depth on this soil, he said eventually. I thought so. She sat back on her heels and looked at what they'd uncovered. What grew here before? Tomatoes on this side, beans along the fence. Somebody had onions started in the back corner a long time ago. Never came to much. He squinted at the soil. Could do better with the right start. We'll plant it properly in the spring, she said. I'll want your input. He looked at her again with that flat-eyed assessment that was apparently just how his face worked. You planning to be here in the spring? It was a fair question. She had been here less than 2 weeks. I'm planning to be here long enough to make the garden worth doing, she said. After that, we'll see. He seemed to accept that. They finished clearing until the light got bad, and then they went inside and Evelyn washed her hands and started dinner. And when she brought it out to the table, there were 8 men sitting there who did not look at her the way they had on the first night, with that particular wariness that men have around women they don't know yet, but more like they had simply gotten used to her presence, which was its own kind of acceptance. She noticed Rowan notice it. I didn't say anything about it. He just ate his dinner and listened to whatever conversation was happening at the table. And when his eyes crossed hers for a moment across the food and the lamplight, there was something in his expression that was harder to read than she would have liked. She looked away first. The thing about Gerald Fitch was that he did not simply go away. She had assumed he would. Men who behave badly usually do one of two things when confronted with the consequences of it. They either become aggressive about defending themselves, or they become very quiet and hope everyone forgets. She had expected Gerald to be the second kind, given that the note had been 4 sentences long and he had sent a housekeeper rather than face her himself. She had been wrong. On the 14th day after her arrival, she went into Red Hollow with Rowan and Dutch to pick up supplies. It was the first time she had been back in town since arriving, and she felt the attention of it, not hostile exactly, but present. That specific awareness of being watched that she was learning was simply part of what it meant to be a woman alone in a community where everyone knew everyone's business. The general store was run by a man named Caldwell, compact and efficient, who greeted Rowan with a handshake and her with a nod that she interpreted as reserved approval, which was fine. She had her list. She worked through it methodically, checking items against the stock, making decisions about quantities, noting what was unavailable and what substitutions would work. Rowan stood near the door and talked to Caldwell about something to do with cattle prices that she was only half listening to. She was examining a bolt of canvas, useful for a dozen things. The kitchen curtains were deteriorating rapidly when she became aware of Gerald Fitch in her peripheral vision. He had come in while she was focused on the shelves. I was standing near the counter with another man she didn't recognize, and she could feel him looking at her with the specific quality of attention that means someone has been building up to something and has just found the moment they were waiting for. She did not turn around. "I heard you found yourself a position," Gerald said. He had a way of saying things that managed to be conversational and pointed at the same time, the voice of a man who had been practicing small cruelties long enough to make them sound offhand. Blackridge's place. Cooking for cowhands. Evelyn set down the canvas bolt, measured her breath, and turned. He was shorter than she had imagined from his letters. She had imagined him as larger, somehow, which was probably the optimism of a woman hoping for the best. He had the mustache from the photograph and a complexion that suggested too much time indoors for a man who owned land. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately, the look of a man who expected her to be embarrassed. "Mr. Fitch," she said pleasantly. "Good morning." He blinked. Apparently he had expected something else. "I wanted to say," he began. "You said what you had to say," Evelyn said, still pleasantly. "In your note, 4 sentences. I thought it was concise." The man beside him made a small sound. Gerald's jaw tightened. "I meant no disrespect." "Then you should have considered your actions more carefully," she said, with the same pleasant tone, because she had discovered early in life that pleasantness was more devastating than anger in these situations, and it required less energy besides. "As it happens, I'm employed, I'm comfortable, and I'm in the middle of selecting supplies. So if there's nothing else, I just thought you should know," Gerald said, and his voice had shifted now, lost some of the casual edge, gotten more deliberate, "that people talk in a town this size about what it looks like, a woman living at a man's ranch without what exactly?" The voice came from behind Evelyn. She did not startle because she had heard Rowan cross the floor. He moved quietly for a large man, but not silently, and she had been aware of him approaching for the last several seconds. She simply stood where she was while Rowan came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Gerald Fitch, but beside her, which was a different thing entirely. He was looking at Gerald with an expression that was almost completely blank, which somehow managed to be more unnerving than anger would have been. "Without what?" Rowan said again, calmly. Gerald's companion had taken a half step back. Gerald himself went through several expressions in rapid succession: belligerence, calculation, something that looked almost like fear, before arriving at a kind of deflated justification. "I was only saying—" "I know what you were saying," Rowan's voice hadn't changed at all. "You've been saying various versions of it all over town for 2 weeks. I've let it go because I don't have time to manage other men's mouths." He paused. "I'm running short on patience." Gerald looked between them. Something shifted in his face, something petty and wounded that Evelyn recognized as the expression of a man who thought he was owed something and had been denied it, and who would not forget the denial. He picked up the item he'd been holding, set it back on the counter without buying it, and walked out of the store with his companion without another word. The store was very quiet. Caldwell behind the counter had found something absorbing to do with the ledger in front of him. Evelyn exhaled once, carefully, and turned back to the canvas bolt. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Rowan said. He was already moving back toward the door. "I had it handled," she added. "I know that too," he said, and she thought she heard something in his voice that might have been amusement, though when she looked at him, his expression gave nothing away. "I just didn't want to stand there and listen to it." She watched him for a moment, then she turned back to the canvas and measured what she needed. That night she sat on the front porch of the ranch house after the kitchen was clean and the men were settled and the lamps in the bunkhouse had gone dark. The October air was sharp with the promise of winter. She could feel it in the particular quality of the cold, the way the wind had teeth in it now that it hadn't in the first week. The sky out here was different from anything she had grown up with. It had a depth to it, a kind of layering, and the stars were not the handful she'd seen through Cincinnati's sooty air, but a whole architecture of them, spread from one edge of the hills to the other in a quantity that still surprised her even after 2 weeks. She heard the door behind her and knew, without looking, that it was Rowan. He sat down on the far end of the porch steps, elbows on his knees, looking out at the same sky she'd been looking at, and for a while neither of them said anything. A coyote called out somewhere to the north, and another answered from much farther away, and then it was quiet again. "Does it bother you?" he asked finally. "The talking." She considered the question. "Not the way it would have bothered me a month ago," she said. "A month ago I had a different kind of future to protect. Now I have a different situation, so the stakes are different." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest answer." "I try to give those." Another silence. The wind moved through the dry grass somewhere beyond the barn. "Gerald Fitch is not going to stop," Rowan said. It wasn't a warning exactly, more like the statement of a man who has assessed a situation and is being accurate about it. "He's got a particular kind of pride. He wanted you to arrive here and struggle, and you didn't." "I noticed," she said dryly. "He's going to try to make things harder." Rowan turned and looked at her for the first time since sitting down. In the dark she could see the outline of him, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, but not his expression clearly. "I'm telling you that not to frighten you. I'm telling you so you're not surprised." Evelyn looked at him. "Mr. Blackridge, I've been managing difficult men since I was 16 years old. My father was one. The landlord who took our house after his debts was another. The man who bought my mother's furniture for a quarter of its value while I watched from the doorway was a third." She turned back to the stars. "Gerald Fitch is not the worst I've managed, and he is probably not the last." Rowan was quiet for so long she thought the conversation was over. "Your grandmother," he said then, "the one who taught you medicine." She looked at him sharply. "Who told you about that?" "You mentioned it to Tommy when you were treating his hand." Tommy Briggs had managed to put a splinter deep enough into his palm to require some work, and she had extracted it with a needle and her grandmother's small forceps that she always kept in the tin with her sewing supplies. "He told Dutch. Dutch told me." He paused. "I wasn't prying. It came up." She relaxed slightly. She was a practical woman. She didn't have much formal knowledge, but she had 40 years of experience and she wrote everything down. Evelyn looked at her own hands for a moment. "I have her notebooks. I've been reading them since I was 12. "That's useful out here," Rowan said. "We haven't had a doctor closer than 60 miles since the last one left for Denver." "I know, Tommy told me." She glanced at him. "Is there a reason you're telling me it's useful?" He looked straight ahead again. "No particular reason," he said. But there was something in the way he said it, that careful, measured quality she was beginning to recognize as the way he spoke when he was being more deliberate than the words suggested. She decided not to press it tonight. "Good night, Mr. Blackridge," she said and stood. "Good night, Miss Ashcroft." She went inside and she lay in her room, which had a door with a lock, as promised. And she listened to the Wyoming windwork at the eaves of the house, and she thought about how strangely things had turned out. She had come here to be a wife. She had arrived to be a housekeeper. She was not sure yet what she was becoming, but she was beginning to think it might be something she hadn't had a word for yet. Sleep came easier than it had any right to. She let it. The cold came faster than anyone had predicted. By the middle of October, the ranch was waking each morning to hard frost on the grass, and Evelyn had already shifted the household routine twice to account for it. Earlier fires, heavier meals before the men went out, a system for keeping the water from freezing in the kitchen pipes that she had worked out herself by watching what froze first and what didn't. Rowan had noticed without commenting on it, which she had come to understand was his version of approval. He was not a man who said well done when well done was simply what he expected, but he stopped explaining things to her the way he had in the first week, the way you explain things to someone you're not sure will manage, and that silence meant more than any compliment would have. The ranch settled into her like she was settling into it, slowly and not without friction. Tommy Briggs had appointed himself her unofficial assistant in all things, which was sometimes useful and sometimes exhausting, and Dutch Carver had graduated from assessing her to something that looked, from a distance, like grudging respect. The other men occupied various positions on the spectrum between those two. Hector remained her quietest ally. A hand named Stills, who was older than the rest and had a damaged knee that made the hard physical work increasingly difficult, had started appearing in the kitchen doorway in the late afternoons, not asking for anything, just sitting on the step and talking, the way lonely people do when they've finally found someone who will listen without rushing them along. She didn't mind. She liked Stills. He had been on the ranch for 11 years and knew things about it that weren't written anywhere, and she had learned more about the land and the operation and the history of Rowan Blackridge from those late afternoon doorstep conversations than she had from any other source. He bought this place back from the bank, Stills told her one afternoon, 3 weeks into her time on the ranch. He was on the step, nursing his knee with the particular careful posture of a man managing chronic pain, and she was at the counter working through a batch of bread dough. His father had mortgaged it, twice. Rowan was 23. He had $140 saved and a debt bigger than most men earn in a decade. Evelyn kept working the dough. How did he manage it? Worked, Stills said simply. Hired himself out everywhere he could, sent every dollar home, lived on nothing. Took him 4 years. 4th year he came home and found the bank had sent a man to start inventory. He paused. He walked that man off the property with the deed in one hand and a paid receipt in the other. Barely. She thought about the list of supply costs Rowan had written for her, the careful organization of it. He keeps close track of money. Knows what it means to not have it, Stills said. That kind of knowing doesn't leave a man. She turned the dough and pressed her palms into it. What about the scar? Stills was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Bar fight, he said finally. Not his fight, originally. Some young cowhand was getting the worst of it from 3 men outside the saloon in Cheyenne. Rowan stepped in. He shifted his knee. He was 25, 26. Got cut for his trouble. Cowhand made it out fine. A pause. Never found out the kid's name. Evelyn said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that, and she had found that some things landed better in silence. The dough was right. She covered it and set it near the stove and washed her hands. And when she turned around, Stills was looking at her with those old, watchful eyes. He's not easy, Stills said, in case you hadn't figured that out. I had figured that out. He's not dishonest either, and he doesn't waste things. The old man looked out toward the yard. People, work, time. He said it like those 3 things were equally valuable, which she supposed for a man like Rowan they probably were. She dried her hands. Why are you telling me this, Stills? He looked back at her, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was almost sly. No reason, he said, and pushed himself to his feet and went back to the barn. The situation with Gerald Fitch clarified itself at the end of October in a way that was worse than she had expected and more predictable than it should have been. She had gone into town again with Tommy for a supply run. Rowan had stayed back with a problem in the south pasture, and the errand was routine until she came out of the dry goods store and found 3 women blocking her path on the boardwalk. Not physically blocking, not quite, but standing in a configuration that required her to either stop or go around them, and the middle one, a tall, angular woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who was married to one of the town's 2 lawyers, had the expression of someone who has rehearsed what she is about to say. Miss Ashcroft, Mrs. Hargrove said, with a smile that did not involve her eyes at all. I've been hoping to speak with you. Tommy behind her went very still. She could feel it. Mrs. Hargrove, Evelyn said. Several of us have been concerned, Mrs. Hargrove continued, about the situation. A woman alone at a ranch, unmarried, no family nearby. It puts you in a difficult position, and of course it creates difficulties for Mr. Blackridge's reputation as well. We thought perhaps you hadn't fully considered. I've considered it thoroughly, Evelyn said. Of course you have, dear. But you're new here, and you may not understand how these things look in a community like ours. Gerald Fitch is not my employer, Evelyn said, or my guardian, or any particular concern of mine. She kept her voice level and her expression pleasant, which took some effort. I appreciate that you're framing this as concern for my welfare, but what you're describing is not concern. It's the town's discomfort with a situation that doesn't fit its expectations, which is a different thing. Mrs. Hargrove's smile went thin. All I'm saying, I know what you're saying. Evelyn shifted the weight of her parcel. Good afternoon, Mrs. Hargrove. She walked around them without hurrying. She heard one of the other women say something in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. She kept walking. Tommy fell in beside her with the long-legged urgency of someone trying to match her pace without appearing to run. That was Mrs. Hargrove, he said, as if she might not have noticed. I gathered. Her husband is one of Fitch's friends, has been for years. He glanced back over his shoulder. She doesn't usually talk to people like that. She's usually more careful. Evelyn loaded her parcel into the wagon without looking at him. She was careful. That was the careful version. Tommy climbed up to the driver's seat, and they pulled out of town, and she sat with the Wyoming hills rolling past, and thought about what it meant that Gerald Fitch had moved from making comments in the saloon to deploying his friends' wives. It meant he felt he was losing something. That was the thing about men like Gerald. They were dangerous not when they had what they wanted, but when they had convinced themselves they were owed something and were being denied it. She was not afraid, but she was paying attention now in a different way. What? When she told Rowan that evening, he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He didn't finish your sentences or offer solutions before you'd finished explaining the problem. Hargrove's involved, he said when she'd finished. His wife, but yes. He was at the kitchen table with his ledger and a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold 20 minutes ago. He turned his cup in a slow circle without lifting it. Hargrove's been wanting to purchase the east pasture for 2 years. I've said no twice. He'd be pleased enough to have me at a disadvantage. Is this something I need to worry about? She asked directly. He looked up at her. No, he said. It's something I need to manage. There's a difference. Mr. Blackridge. She sat down across from him, which she didn't usually do in the evenings. She respected his space with the ledger, the way she hoped he respected hers in the kitchen. I am not a problem you inherited. I am a person you employed. If there is something happening that affects my position here, I would rather know it. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration, the look of a man adjusting to something he hadn't fully accounted for. Fair, he said. Sit down. I am sitting down. He looked at where she was sitting and seemed to register it for the first time. Right. He pushed the ledger aside. Gerald went to Hargrove 2 weeks ago. I know this because Caldwell told me. Caldwell hears everything that passes through that store, and most of what passes through this town passes through that store eventually. He wants Hargrove to make some kind of formal complaint about the... He paused, and she could see him choosing the words carefully. About the impropriety of your situation here. He thinks if Hargrove applies enough pressure, you'll leave. Evelyn absorbed this. And if I leave? He wins, or he thinks he does. Rowan picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. He's been telling people you only took the job because you had no other choice, and that you'll move on as soon as something better comes along. He's been suggesting I was foolish to take you on. A pause. He said more than that. I won't repeat it. Tell me. His jaw tightened briefly. He said a woman who'd already been thrown over once would be grateful for whatever attention she could get, and that I should be careful not to confuse gratitude for something it wasn't. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. I see, Evelyn said. He doesn't know you, Rowan said. The way he said it was flat and factual, not comforting, and for that reason it was more effective as a comfort than most reassurances she had ever received. No, she agreed. He doesn't. She stood up. I'm going to finish the mending. Is there anything else that requires addressing tonight? No, he said. Nothing that can't wait. She picked up the mending basket from the shelf by the door and went to the sitting room, and she sat by the lamp and worked through the pile of things that needed work. 2 shirts of Tommy's that he was genuinely hard on clothing, a pair of Stills's work pants, one of her own dresses with a hem coming loose, and she stitched with the particular precision she always brought to clothes work, and she thought about Gerald Fitch and Hargrove and Mrs. Hargrove and the whole machinery of petty social warfare, and she thought about what Rowan had said. Not the part about Gerald, but the other part. "He doesn't know you," said with such simple certainty, like it was a settled fact. She was not sure when that had become something she cared about, that Rowan Blackridge knew her. She noticed that she did care, and she noticed herself noticing, and then she made a deliberate decision to think about something else, and held to it with moderate success. November came with real cold and the first real snow. The ranch transformed under it in a way that was simultaneously beautiful and demanding. Every task took longer. The horses needed more tending. The kitchen required constant management because warmth had become critical rather than comfortable. Evelyn extended her days accordingly. She was up before first light to have the stove going and breakfast ready before the men faced the cold, and she was often the last one up at night, accounting for what had been used and what would be needed in the days ahead. She was tired. That was the honest accounting. Not broken, not resentful, but genuinely tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been working at the edge of their capacity for weeks. She did not say this to anyone, because saying it would not help, and she had not yet built the kind of closeness with anyone here that made that kind of admission feel safe. Except possibly with Hector, who on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November found her sitting on the back step in the cold with her eyes closed and her coffee going cold in her hands, and who sat down beside her without a word and simply sat there for 5 minutes before going back to work. He never mentioned it. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated advice. The injury happened on a Thursday. One of the younger hands, a man named Cass, who had only been on the ranch 2 months, was moving lumber in the barn when a stack shifted. It caught him across the upper arm and the shoulder, and the sound of it brought 3 men running. Evelyn was at the clothesline when she heard the commotion, and she went directly to the barn, not running but moving fast, and she pushed past Dutch and Tommy to get to where Cass was sitting on the ground against the wall. He was conscious, which was good. His arm was at an angle that suggested, at minimum, a bad break, and his face was the particular gray-white of someone in significant pain, managing not to pass out through sheer stubbornness. She knelt beside him and looked at the arm without touching it yet. "Cass, look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were working properly. "Can you feel your fingers?" He tried, winced, tried again. "Yeah," he said through his teeth. "Yeah, I can feel them." "Good, that's good." She looked up at Dutch. "Get a flat board about this long and as wide as his arm. And clean cloth. There's a pile in the kitchen, second shelf on the left. And someone needs to ride for a doctor." She looked at the angle of the arm. "This is beyond what I can set safely." "Doctor's in Mill Haven," Dutch said. 60 miles. "I know. Go fast." She looked back at Cass. "You're going to be all right. You're going to have a bad couple of days, but you're going to be all right." "My arm's broken," he said. "Your arm is broken," she confirmed, because she had always believed in telling people the truth about their own bodies. "But it's broken in a way that can heal correctly if we take care of it. So we're going to take care of it." She glanced up. "Tommy, get me the small tin from my room. It's on the top of the trunk. It's got a red lid. Bring the whole thing." Tommy went at a dead run. She appreciated that about him. Whatever his shortcomings, he moved when you needed him to move. By the time Rowan appeared in the barn doorway, he had been in the north pasture and had ridden back at speed when word reached him. Cass was splinted and stabilized and significantly more comfortable than he had been 20 minutes earlier. The pain was not gone, but it was managed, and he had color in his face again. And he was drinking the small cup of something Evelyn had mixed from her grandmother's notes, which would not cure anything but would help with the edge of the pain until the doctor arrived. Rowan stood in the doorway and looked at the scene. Cass propped against the barn wall with his arm immobilized. Dutch and 2 other men nearby. Tommy hovering with the expression of someone who has been extremely useful and is very pleased about it. And then his eyes found Evelyn, who was washing her hands in the bucket by the door. "He'll need the doctor," she said, before Rowan could ask anything. "Dutch is gone already. The arm is broken, but it's clean. No bone came through, no nerve damage that I can detect. He's stable." She dried her hands. "He shouldn't move the arm, and he shouldn't be alone tonight." "He'll stay in the house," Rowan said. "We'll put him in the spare room." He was looking at her with that particular expression she still hadn't found a clean word for. You did this yourself. I did what I could. The doctor will do the rest. You kept him calm. I could see it from the doorway. He paused. Where did you learn to splint an arm? My grandmother's notebook, page 43. She said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, and he looked at her with something that had moved beyond the expression she couldn't name into something she could. It was the look of a man encountering a person who is more than he had accounted for, and knowing it. She went inside to get the spare room ready. The doctor arrived the following afternoon, examined Cass thoroughly, declared the splint correctly applied, reset the arm with Evelyn assisting, and told Rowan on his way out that whoever had managed the injury before his arrival had probably saved the man the use of his arm. Rowan found her in the kitchen after the doctor's wagon had gone. He said you likely saved the arm, Rowan said. He may be overstating it, Evelyn said. She was making soup. Cass would need something easy to eat for the next several days, and soup made in quantity was efficient. I kept him still, and I kept him calm. The doctor did the work. Evelyn. It was the first time he had used her first name. She became aware of it immediately, the way you become aware of a sound that has been absent and suddenly appears. She turned and looked at him. Thank you, he said. Just that. Not elaborated, not extended. But he said it with his full attention on her face, not distracted, not perfunctory. You're welcome, she said, and turned back to the soup because she needed to do something with her hands. He stayed in the kitchen doorway a moment longer than necessary, and then he went out to the evening chores, and Evelyn stirred the soup and told herself very firmly that she was a practical woman in a practical situation and that she was not going to become confused about what this was. She was not sure she believed herself, but she kept telling herself anyway. December arrived with a particular kind of cold that Evelyn had never experienced before, the kind that comes in off the open land and has nothing to stop it, no buildings or hills to break it, just 40 miles of nothing, and then it's in your face. She learned to dress in layers before going anywhere near the door, a lesson that took exactly one early morning of misjudgment to permanently establish. She was in the barn on the 10th of December. There was a mare that had been off her feed for 2 days, and Evelyn had made it her business to check on her twice daily, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main gate. Not an argument exactly, something with more tension in it than an argument. She came out of the barn and saw Rowan standing at the gate with 2 men on horseback. She didn't recognize either of them. They weren't from Red Hollow. Their horses and their gear had the look of men who had been traveling and not the look of men who had come from a town. Rowan's posture was the particular kind of still that she had come to read, over 2.5 months, as the posture he had when he was containing something. Dutch was nearby, not close enough to be part of the conversation, but close enough to matter. She went back into the barn and stayed there, because some things required presence, and some things required the wisdom to stay out of the way, and she was still learning which was which in this place. But she watched through the gap in the barn door until the men turned their horses and rode back down the road they had come on. And then she watched Rowan stand there a moment after they were gone, with his hands at his sides and his face turned toward the road. At dinner that night, he was quieter than usual, not distracted. He was present, he answered questions, he ate, but there was something deliberate about his quiet, the way a man is quiet when he is carrying something and has decided not to set it down where others can see it. She waited until the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean and she was banking the fire for the night, and then she said without turning around, "Who were they?" She heard the slight shift of his chair. "How do you know something's wrong?" "I don't know that something's wrong. I know that 2 men came to the gate and you've been quiet since." She turned and looked at him. "You don't have to tell me. But I've learned enough about this place to know when something is off. And if it affects the ranch, it affects the household, which is my concern." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "They work for a man named Prentice, Luther Prentice. He operates a cattle enterprise out of the north, near the border." He paused. "He's been buying land in this county, quietly. He's already acquired 4 ranches in the past 2 years, 3 of them from men who had debt they couldn't service, 1 from a widow who didn't understand what she was signing. And he wants your land," Evelyn said. "He wants the water rights that come with my land." Rowan's voice was even, but something underneath it was not. "My property controls access to 3 miles of Ridge Creek. Whoever controls that water controls what survives in this county in a dry year." He folded his hands on the table. His men came to deliver a price. It was a fair price. But you're not selling. No. She sat down across from him, the way she had that other night. What happens if you refuse? He looked at her steadily. I don't know yet. But men like Prentice don't generally take no gracefully. The kitchen held the particular silence of two people sitting with an uncomfortable truth. Does anyone else in the county know he's doing this? She asked. Some. Not all of them understand what it means yet. He paused. By the time they do, it may be too late for some of them. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table and thought. This was the kind of problem that could not be solved with mending or soup or a properly organized kitchen. This was a different kind of problem, the kind that required information and coordination and the willingness to name what was happening before someone with power managed to reframe it into something more palatable. She had watched her father lose everything to men who operated exactly this way, not through violence or obvious wrongdoing, but through the slow accumulation of quiet pressure and signed documents and the exploitation of people who didn't know what they were signing. You need to talk to the other ranchers, she said, the ones who haven't sold yet, before Prentice gets to them individually. Rowan looked at her like she had said something obvious and necessary at the same time. I know. Then what's stopping you? He was quiet for a moment. Some of them don't trust me. I've had disputes with two of them over grazing rights. One of them, Morrison, to the east, has believed for years that I pushed his fence line. He paused. Which I didn't. But believing and knowing are different things. Can any of that be resolved? Some of it, not quickly. Then start with what can be resolved. She looked at him. And in the meantime, write everything down, every interaction with Prentice's men, every date, every name, every offer made. If this becomes a legal matter, and it may, documentation is what wins it. She paused. My father's lawyer told him that too late. Don't let it be too late for you. Rowan was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not the usual careful assessment, something more open than that, and the openness of it was slightly startling because it was rare. You've thought about this kind of thing before, he said. I've lived through this kind of thing before, she said. It looks different from a Cincinnati tenement than from a Wyoming ranch, but the mechanism is the same. Someone with more resources tries to use those resources to take what belongs to someone who has fewer. She met his eyes. The people with fewer resources lose when they're alone and uninformed. They have a chance when they're not. The fire had burned down while they were talking. The kitchen was colder than it had been at the start of the conversation, and neither of them had moved to add wood. Rowan said, You are not what I expected. It was not a compliment exactly. It was something more complicated than a compliment. An honest admission from a man who did not make them frequently. She recognized it as such, and did not make light of it. No, she said. I don't imagine I am. She got up and added 2 logs to the fire and didn't look at him while she did it. And when she turned back, he was still at the table, but some of the contained quality had shifted out of him, like a held breath slowly let go. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, the tiredness of a man who has been managing alone for a long time and has just, briefly, not been alone. She picked up her lamp from the shelf by the door. Good night, Rowan, she said. It came out of her naturally, the first name, without the deliberation it might have required 2 months ago. He looked up, and something in his face, in the lamplight, was simply human, not the rancher or the employer or the feared figure from town gossip, but a person who had been carrying more than his share and had just had someone sit across a table from him and help him think through it. Good night, Evelyn, he said. She took her lamp and went to her room, and she lay in the dark and listened to the Wyoming winter work at the windows. And she thought that something had shifted in the past hour that she could not have named precisely, but could not pretend she hadn't noticed. She didn't try to pretend. She was too tired for pretending. She let herself simply know it, and then she let herself sleep. The morning Rowan rode out to speak with Morrison, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind had the particular bite of a season that had stopped making promises. Evelyn watched him go from the kitchen window, his breath visible in the cold air, Dutch riding beside him with the squared-off posture of a man who expected trouble and had dressed accordingly for it. She had not asked to come. She understood, without being told, that her presence at a conversation between 2 men who had been in a land dispute for years would complicate things rather than help them. And she had learned by now to distinguish between the situations where she was useful and the ones where she would simply be in the way. She turned back to the kitchen and got on with the work. The documentation had already begun. 3 nights after the conversation about Prentice, she had sat down at the kitchen table after everyone else was asleep with a blank ledger she had found in the storeroom and begun writing. Not everything. She didn't have everything yet. But what she had, the dates Prentice's men had appeared at the gate, the names they had given, the price they had offered, the names of the 4 ranches she knew had already sold. She had organized it by date on the left-hand page and by category on the right: land parcels, water access, known connections between buyers. It was the same method she had used to manage the household supplies, applied to a different problem, and it had the same quality of making a complicated thing visible and therefore manageable. When she had shown it to Rowan, he had sat with it for a long time without speaking. Then he had said, "Where did you learn to organize information this way?" "My mother kept the household accounts after my father stopped being reliable about it," she said. "I helped her from the time I was 14. She paused. Numbers don't lie the way explanations do. If you track everything, eventually the shape of a thing becomes clear. He had taken the ledger and added 3 entries of his own, things he knew that she didn't, the names of 2 men who worked for Prentice that he had encountered before, a date that corresponded to the first time Prentice had sent a representative to Red Hollow. He had a particular way of printing letters, angular and definite, that matched the way he spoke. She noticed it without meaning to. The ledger was locked in the desk in Rowan's study now. She had made a copy in her own hand and kept it in her trunk, tucked between the pages of the poetry book she had carried since she was 16. She had not told him about the copy. It was not that she didn't trust him. It was that she had learned, from watching her father, that important documents existed in one place until they didn't, and then they were simply gone, and gone was not a situation she intended to find herself in again. Rowan came back in the late afternoon with Dutch, and his expression when he came through the door was not what she had hoped for, but also not as bad as she had feared, which she was learning to accept as the range of outcomes available to them at present. "Morrison won't meet," Rowan said. He sat down at the kitchen table and she put coffee in front of him without asking. He drank it without acknowledging it, which meant he was preoccupied, not ungrateful. His wife came to the door, said he wasn't available. His horse was in the yard. "He was there," Evelyn said. "He was there." Rowan wrapped both hands around the mug. Dutch saw smoke from a chimney in the south room. "Morrison knows I know. He just doesn't care." "Does he know about Prentice's other purchases?" "I don't know what he knows. I wrote him a letter 2 weeks ago explaining what I'd learned. He didn't respond." Rowan set down the mug. "He's either in Prentice's pocket already, or he's afraid, or he's simply too stubborn to accept help from a man he's had a grievance with for 6 years. He paused. "Probably some of all 3. "What about the others?" "Halcott and the widow." "Mrs. Reed?" Rowan looked slightly surprised that she knew the names, then not surprised, because by now he had stopped being surprised by what she knew. "Halcott agreed to a meeting. Next week, at his place. He's cautious, but he's not stupid." He paused. "Mrs. Reed I'm less sure about. She's been managing alone since her husband died last spring. She may not fully understand the water rights issue." "Then explain it to her." Evelyn sat down across from him. "Directly. Don't let Prentice's men explain it first, because they'll explain it in a way that makes selling sound like the sensible choice." She thought for a moment. Would she be more receptive to the conversation if I came with you?" Rowan looked at her. "Why would—" He stopped, reconsidered. "You think she'd trust you more than she'd trust me?" "I think a widow being asked to make a major financial decision might be more comfortable if there's another woman in the room who isn't trying to sell her anything." She shrugged. "I might be wrong, but it seems worth trying." He was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned meant he was actually considering it rather than dismissing it. "I'll think about it," he said. She let it rest there. The snow came seriously in January, the kind that closed roads and made the 60-mile journey to the doctor academic rather than practical, and Evelyn was grateful for everything she had stocked in December. She had pushed their supply orders to the edge of what was reasonable, and Rowan had not questioned her numbers, which she had taken as permission to continue. The pantry was full, the woodpile was high enough. They had enough lamp oil for 3 months if she was careful, which she was. The enforced proximity of winter changed things slowly and in ways that were difficult to pin down. The evenings got longer. The kitchen became the center of everything, not just because it was warm, but because it was where the fire was. And people congregate around fire the way they always have. The ranch hands drifted in after dinner instead of going directly to the bunkhouse. Not every night, not all of them, but enough of them often enough that the kitchen after dinner became something closer to a common room than it had ever been when she arrived. Stills told stories. He had a gift for it. The kind of unhurried storytelling that builds slowly and then delivers something you didn't see coming. And she would keep her hands busy with mending or accounts while he talked. And she would listen, and the men would listen, and Rowan would sit at the far end of the table with his coffee, and sometimes he was listening too, and sometimes he was in his own thoughts, and she could tell the difference. On a Sunday night in January, Stills was midway through an account of a cattle drive he'd been on in 1869 when Tommy Briggs fell asleep, sitting up, and tipped sideways into Dutch, who pushed him upright without breaking conversation, and the whole room laughed, real laughter, not polite laughter, and Evelyn looked up from her mending at the sound of it. Rowan was laughing too, or almost. It was the closest she had seen him get. The lines around his eyes, the way his jaw had relaxed out of its usual set. It lasted only a moment, and then he looked across the room and caught her looking, and neither of them looked away immediately. And for a moment that was just a moment. Nothing happened except that two people saw each other clearly in good lamplight. Then Tommy startled himself awake and said something incoherent, and the room laughed again, and the moment passed. She looked back down at her mending. She took 3 stitches before she noticed she had put them in the wrong place and had to take them out again, which was not like her, and she refused to think about why. The cattle theft happened in the second week of February, and it happened fast enough that the damage was done before anyone on the ranch fully understood what they were dealing with. Evelyn woke to the dogs going frantic. Not the usual patrol bark, but the sustained, alarmed sound of animals responding to something genuinely wrong. And then to boots on the stairs and Rowan's voice in the hall, low and rapid, giving orders. She was dressed and at her door before the second set of boots passed it. "Stay inside," Rowan said, seeing her. He was pulling on his coat, his movements quick but controlled. "Lock the door." "What's happening?" Cass's jaw was set in the way she had learned to read as, "This is bad, and I don't have time to explain the full extent of it." Dutch counted the tracks, 40 head at least. They went through the south fence. He was already moving toward the stairs. "Don't open the door for anyone until Dutch or I tell you to." "Rowan." She caught his arm, not forcefully, just enough. And he stopped and looked at her. "Cass's arm is still healing. He can't ride hard. He stays here." He registered it, nodded once. "Cass stays. The others come with me." She let go of his arm, and he went. And she stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the organized chaos of 7 men and horses moving through the dark. And then she heard them go. And then she heard nothing but the dogs and the wind and the creak of the house in the cold. She went downstairs. Cass was already in the kitchen, his arm in its sling, his expression a combination of wounded pride and genuine worry. I was 24 and he had been on the ranch for 4 months, and he had formed, over the course of those months, the particular attachment to a place that young men form when they found somewhere they feel they belong. "How many went?" he asked. "All of them but you." She went to the stove. "Sit down, Cass. You can't ride. You can be useful here." "How am I useful here?" She looked at him steadily. "You're a second pair of eyes and hands if something comes to the house. And right now you're someone I can talk to while I wait, which is more useful than you think." She filled the kettle. "Sit down." He sat. They sat together in the kitchen through the long hours of that night. She made coffee, then made it again when that pot went cold, and Cass talked when he needed to talk and was quiet when he needed to be quiet. And she kept the stove fed and kept her hands occupied and did not let herself think too specifically about what 40 head of stolen cattle meant for a ranch already facing pressure from Prentice. She thought about the general shape of it, the way she thought about the household budget. What was the total? What was the exposure? What were the options? She kept the specific worry, the one with Rowan's name on it, the one that was about more than cattle, at a careful distance. She was not always successful at keeping it there, but she kept trying. They came back at midday and they came back with the cattle. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of hooves in quantity, the dogs, Dutch's voice carrying over everything with its particular carrying quality. She went to the door and saw them coming up the road, the stolen cattle moving in a loose bunch ahead of the riders, and she counted heads. Cattle first, then horses, then men. Before she could stop herself from doing it, all 7 horses, all 7 men. She exhaled and didn't examine the specific character of her relief. Rowan came in while the others were settling the herd. He looked like a man who had been in a saddle for 9 hours in February and had also been in at least one confrontation that hadn't been entirely resolved through negotiation. There was a cut on his chin, dried blood on his collar. He moved without favoring anything, which meant nothing was broken or he wasn't admitting to it. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine, I said sit down." He sat with the particular compliance of a very tired man who is more tired than he is stubborn. She got water in her grandmother's tin, and she cleaned the cut on his chin, which was shallow but had bled more than it deserved to, the way face cuts do. "How many were there?" she asked, working carefully. "6, he said. "Young men, mostly, not professionals." He was quiet while she worked. "They were hired out of Red Hollow. We recognized 2 of them." She stopped, looked at him. "Hired by whom?" His eyes met hers. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. "Prentice," she said. "We can't prove it. Not yet." He held still while she pressed the cloth against his chin. "But the 2 we recognized, one works at Fitch's stable. Has for 3 years. She thought about that. Fitch is working with Prentice." "That's what I think." His voice was controlled, but something beneath it was not. "Fitch has been selling information. What we run, what our range looks like, our patrol patterns." He paused. "Information that only someone with regular access to Red Hollow and knowledge of this ranch would have." Evelyn set down the cloth. "Tommy talks in town." "Tommy talks everywhere." He said it without anger. It was simply accurate. "He doesn't mean harm. He's 20 years old and he doesn't understand what he's carrying. He needs to know." "I'll talk to him." Rowan's jaw tightened briefly. "I'll talk to all of them. From here the information gets managed more carefully." She put away her grandmother's tin with the deliberate movements of someone managing their own reaction. "The men who were caught, what happened to them?" "We held them until they told us what they knew. Then we let them go with the understanding that if they showed up on Blackridge land again, it would go differently." He looked at his hands, which had the redness of a man who had been in the cold for 9 hours and possibly in a fight. "I'm not a lawman. I can't hold people." "Did they tell you who hired them?" "Not directly, but they told us enough." He looked at her. "I'm going to write to the county sheriff, today, before anything else." "Good." She had been thinking this since the night before, since the moment he had told her it was Prentice. "And the ledger needs to be updated. Every detail from today, the tracks, the number of cattle, the names of the men you recognized, the connection to Fitch's stable, written down tonight, while it's exact." "I know." He looked at her with that unguarded quality she had started seeing more often in the past weeks. "I was already thinking it." "I know you were," she said. "I just wanted to say it anyway." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was near one. "In case I forgot." "In case it helped to hear it." The conversation with Tommy was not what she expected. Rowan had it privately, in the barn, and whatever was said in that barn produced a version of Tommy Briggs she hadn't seen before. Quieter, more contained, with a new awareness around the eyes that suggested someone who has just understood that the innocent thing they were doing was not actually innocent. He came to dinner that night and ate without talking, which was sufficiently unprecedented that Hector looked at him across the table twice to verify he was still there. After dinner, Tommy helped her clear the table, which he also had never done before, and when the others had filed out, he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Miss Ashcroft, I'm sorry if I said things I shouldn't have." She looked at him. He was genuinely stricken, in the way of young people who have not yet developed the defensive mechanisms that allow adults to minimize their mistakes. "You weren't malicious," she said. "You were just young, and you didn't know what you were carrying." "I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot. You made a mistake that a lot of people make." She handed him the pot to dry. "Now you know, and you'll be more careful, and that's what matters." She paused. "Do you know which things you said and to whom?" "Some of it," he said miserably. "Think through it carefully and tell Rowan everything you can remember. Whatever you told them, he needs to know so he can account for it." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Then we move forward. That's all we can do." He dried the pot with the careful attention of someone performing penance, and she let him, because sometimes a person needed to do something with their hands while their conscience caught up with them. Oh. The night the barn was set on fire was the night everything shifted in a direction that couldn't be undone. It was late March. The snow had loosened its grip, and the mud had come. The deep, claiming mud of a Wyoming spring that pulled at boots and wagon wheels with equal determination. She had spent the afternoon working in the kitchen garden with Hector, who had been planning the spring planting with her in the deliberate, unhurried way he did everything, and she had gone to bed early, genuinely tired, and had been deep in sleep when the shouting started. She was at her window before she was fully awake. The barn was on the south end of the yard, and it was lit from inside with the particular orange that was not lantern light and not the color of any good thing. The dogs were screaming. She could hear Rowan's voice below. She could not make out the words, but the quality of command in it was unmistakable. That particular cutting authority that people respond to before they've processed what's being said. She did not stand at the window. She dressed. She pulled on her boots and her heaviest coat, and she took her grandmother's tin from the trunk. The full tin, everything in it. And she went downstairs and out the back door because the front door was chaos, and she needed to be useful, not swept up in it. The horses. That was the first thought. If the fire spread to the barn and the horses were still inside, everything downstream of this night would be worse. She went around the side of the house and saw that Dutch and Hector were already at the barn doors. The horses were coming out, being pulled and gentled and walked clear, the animals' panic visible in the whites of their eyes and the high arc of their necks. Good. She looked back at the barn. The fire was in the southeast corner, probably started from outside. She could see where the wall was burning outward rather than in, which meant an accelerant, which meant it was intentional, which meant she already knew. She looked for Rowan and found him at the pump, organizing a bucket line with 3 of the men, his voice the steady thread running through the organized panic of it. She went to the pump. "The southeast corner," she said, stepping beside him. "It started from outside the wall. They used something to get it going fast." He looked at her briefly, absorbing it. "How many are injured?" "I don't know yet. I just came out." "Stills." Rowan raised his voice, and Stills appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, moving with the painful urgency of a man whose knee had not been consulted about this situation. "Stay with Evelyn. Anyone who takes smoke or takes a burn, bring them to her." "I'll need water and clean cloth," she said, "and space away from the fire, the house, the porch." "Use the house," Rowan said. He was already moving back toward the bucket line. She took Stills by the arm and they went to the house, and she set up what she needed at the kitchen table. The lamp turned high, her grandmother's tin open and organized in the way she had long since memorized. The first man came in 15 minutes later, one of the younger hands, his forearm caught by a burning piece of material that had fallen from the wall when they broke through to get the last of the horses out. The burn was not the worst she had seen in her grandmother's notebooks, which described much more serious injuries, but it required cleaning and wrapping, and she did it carefully and talked to him while she did it, steadily, not about the fire, just about his breathing and the pressure and what to expect. 3 more burns over the next hour. One serious, Dutch, who had gone back into the barn for a horse that hadn't come out and had been in there when part of the ceiling came down. He got out. The horse got out. But the burn on his shoulder and the back of his neck was the kind she had hoped not to see tonight. She worked on Dutch for a long time, and he was very still under her hands, with the stoic blankness of a man enduring something he has decided not to acknowledge. And she worked carefully and talked very little. "This is going to hurt for a few days," she said. "Already hurts," he said. "I know." She kept working. "You're going to be all right, Dutch." He said nothing for a moment, then, "Horse make it out?" The horse made it out. She felt rather than heard him exhale. The fire burned for 3 hours. By the time it was fully out, the barn was standing. The structure had held, the stone foundation and the timber framing surviving what had been deliberately set to destroy them. But the southeast wall was gone, and the interior was a ruin of char and smoke damage and ruined feed. 2 of the stalls would need to be entirely rebuilt. The tools were a total loss. She stood on the porch as the first gray light of dawn came into the sky and watched Rowan move through the ruined space with Dutch and Hector, the 3 of them picking through it with the contained expressions of men assessing damage while the anger is still running hot underneath. She went inside and made coffee. It was the only useful thing left to do. Rowan came in an hour after dawn. He sat at the kitchen table and she put coffee in front of him, and he held it and didn't drink it, and she sat across from him and looked at his face and looked at the state of his hands and at the particular quality of his exhaustion, which was not just physical. "They're going to escalate," he said. "I know. This wasn't a warning, this was a demonstration." He turned the cup in his hands. "They burned the barn to show they can. Next time they'll pick something harder to save." "Or someone," she said carefully. He looked at her. "I've been thinking about that." "I know you have. So have I." She kept her voice steady and her eyes on his. "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "The county sheriff is coming. I sent the telegram last night before the fire. I had already sent for him, which means this fire becomes part of an existing record. It's not just an isolated incident now." He paused. "We also need witnesses. People outside this ranch who know what Prentice is doing and will say so." He looked at her. "That meeting with Halcott. We go this week and we take Mrs. Reed as well, if she'll come." "She'll come," Evelyn said. "Let me write to her." "You don't know her." "I know she's a widow managing alone who's being watched by men who think she doesn't understand what she's sitting on." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I know exactly what to say to her." Rowan held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his face that she had been seeing more and more often in the past weeks. Something that was not just respect or appreciation, something that went a layer deeper than those things. And she was not always sure what to do with it. "All right," he said, "write to her." She got up and got the writing paper and sat back down at the kitchen table, and Rowan sat across from her and drank his cold coffee and watched the light grow in the window. And she wrote to Margaret Reed, a widow she had never met, in the plain and direct language of one woman speaking to another about a threat they shared. She wrote 2 drafts and chose the second one, which was more honest. She sealed it and handed it to Rowan without letting him read it, because some things were better delivered between women without a man's editorial. He took it without asking what it said. That small and particular restraint, that willingness to trust her with a piece of this that he could not see, settled something in her chest that she would think about later when she had the privacy to think about it honestly. She banked the kitchen fire. Outside, the ruined barn stood against a cold March sky, its broken wall open to the wind, everything inside it exposed and damaged and waiting to be rebuilt. She looked at it through the window and thought, "We are still standing." It was not a small thing. It was in fact the only thing that mattered right now. She went to help Stills with the morning feed. Margaret Reed wrote back in 4 days. The letter was short, 2 paragraphs in a handwriting that was careful but showed the slight tremor of someone writing under sustained stress. And it said yes. She would come to the meeting at Halcott's place. She had been waiting, she wrote, for someone to ask her directly, because she had not known how to begin asking herself. Evelyn read the letter twice, then handed it to Rowan without comment. He read it, set it on the table. "You were right," he said. "I usually am about this particular kind of thing," she said, and then caught herself because it had come out more sharply than she intended. She looked at him. "I don't say that to be arrogant. I mean that I've spent a long time watching people in difficult situations and learning what they need to hear." "I know what you mean," he said. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket, and she noticed that the pocket nearest the chest, not the desk drawer. And then she stopped noticing it and went back to the kitchen. The barn rebuilding had started the day after the fire. Rowan had organized it with the efficiency of someone who had already been calculating what it would take while the smoke was still rising, which did not surprise her at all. The men worked on the structure every morning before the regular ranch work began, and she had started bringing coffee out to the work site at 7 in the morning, which had become expected without anyone saying so, and which she had decided she didn't mind because she liked watching the thing go back up. There was something particular about construction, the visible progress of it, the way a damaged thing became whole again through accumulated work, that she found steadying. Dutch's burns were healing. She checked them every morning with the careful attention her grandmother had taught her. Look at the color, smell for infection, assess the new skin forming. He allowed her examinations with the resigned tolerance of a large animal that has decided the procedure is necessary, which she took as high praise from Dutch, who had never been easy about accepting help from anyone. "It itches," he told her one morning, with the specific grievance of a man who has discovered that healing is its own inconvenience. That means it's healing correctly, she said. Don't scratch it. I know better than to scratch a burn. You do, but knowing and doing are different things at 3 in the morning when you've been awake for an hour. She finished and straightened. Another week, and the worst of it will be past. He looked at her with those assessing eyes that had assessed her since the first day. You're different than I expected, he said, when you came. What did you expect? He thought about it with the unhurried consideration he brought to everything. Someone who needed managing, he said finally. She looked at him steadily. And now? The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest she had ever seen Dutch come to a smile. Someone who does the managing, he said, and went back to the barn. The meeting at Halcott's ranch was on the first Thursday of April, and the day of it had the particular quality of early spring in Wyoming. Sharp, clear air, mud everywhere, the hills beginning to show the first gray-green of new grass. Evelyn rode with Rowan in the wagon, with Dutch and Hector behind on horseback. She had dressed carefully, not because she thought it would change the outcome of the meeting, but because she understood that appearances carried weight at a first meeting, and she intended to be taken seriously. She had also brought the ledger. Halcott was a heavy-set man in his 60s with a white beard and the sunburned, wind-roughened complexion of a man who had spent decades outdoors without much concern for what the elements were doing to him. He met them at the door of his ranch house with the guarded cordiality of someone who has decided to be polite until he has reason not to be. His wife stood behind him in the doorway, and she looked at Evelyn with an expression that was frankly curious, which Evelyn found refreshing after months of expressions that had been calculated. Margaret Reed was already there. She was younger than Evelyn had expected, early 40s maybe, though the past year had probably put more lines in her face than the years before it combined. She was slight and composed in the way of someone who has been managing alone and has made a discipline of appearing more contained than they are. She looked at Evelyn when Evelyn came through the door, and something passed across her face. Recognition of some kind. The thing that happens between people who understand each other's situation without having been told the particulars. Mrs. Reed, Evelyn said, I'm glad you came. I'm glad someone asked me to, Margaret said quietly, and that was the beginning of it. They sat around Halcott's dining room table. Rowan and Halcott and Margaret Reed and Evelyn, with Dutch and Hector visible through the window, standing in the yard with Halcott's foreman in the careful way of men who are not part of the conversation but are available if needed. Rowan opened with a direct account of what had happened, the visits from Prentice's men, the cattle theft, the fire. He laid it out factually, without embellishment, in the order it had occurred. Halcott listened without interrupting. Margaret Reed listened with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her face very still. When Rowan finished, Halcott said, I had a visit 2 months ago from a man named Crane. Evelyn looked up sharply. She kept her face neutral. One of Prentice's representatives, Rowan said. So he said. He was polite. He made an offer. Halcott turned his coffee cup on its saucer with one thick finger. It was a decent offer. Did you take it? Rowan asked. Direct, no judgment in his voice. Not yet. Halcott looked up. I wanted to understand what I'd be giving up. Your water access, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. She opened the ledger on the table and turned it so Halcott could read the relevant section. If Prentice acquires the Black Ridge property and your property, he controls access to the Ridge Creek from here to the county line. In a dry year, and there will be dry years, he can control pricing on water for every operation in this valley. She tapped the page. These 4 ranches that have already sold are the upstream properties. He's building from the north down. You and Mr. Blackridge are the last significant holdings before he has control of the full corridor. Halcott looked at the ledger for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. She could see him working through the implications with the careful deliberation of someone who had made his living by not rushing decisions. My grandfather built this place, he said. Not to anyone in particular. I know, Rowan said. Margaret Reed spoke for the first time since the opening exchange. My husband died believing he was leaving me something secure, she said. Her voice was steady, but the effort of making it steady was visible. If I sign that deed over to Prentice's people, I'm not just losing the land. She stopped, collected herself. I'm losing the last thing he built. The room was quiet. Evelyn closed the ledger. Then we don't sign, she said. Any of us. But not signing alone isn't enough. Prentice's strategy works because he approaches people individually, in private, and offers them a choice that seems reasonable until you understand what it costs everyone around you. She looked at Halcott, then at Margaret. What we're doing today is making sure you both understand the full picture. What you do with it is your decision, but it should be an informed one. Halcott looked at Rowan. The sheriff. Coming next week, Rowan said. I've documented everything. Evelyn has kept a parallel record. He said her name naturally, without comment, and she noticed Halcott notice it and set it aside. If Prentice's people come back to any of us, we document that too. When the sheriff arrives, we have a pattern, not an isolated incident. And Fitch? Halcott said. Rowan's expression didn't change much, but something in it sharpened. What about Fitch? He's been talking, Halcott said. Not just about your ranch, about all of us. Who's in debt? Who isn't? Who might be persuadable? He paused. He's been spending a lot of time at the Hargrove house. Hargrove and Prentice have known each other for some years. I should have said something sooner, but I wasn't sure what I had was anything beyond speculation. Tell me what you have, Rowan said. All of it. Halcott told them. It took 40 minutes and 2 pots of coffee that Mrs. Halcott brought without being asked, and by the end of it, the picture that emerged was clearer and more organized than any of them had individually understood. Fitch had been feeding information to Hargrove, who had been relaying it to Prentice's operation. The legal framework was being handled by a firm in Cheyenne with known connections to large land consolidation efforts elsewhere in the territory. The timing was not accidental. Prentice had been waiting for a specific combination of dry season, debt pressure, and isolation to make his move, and he had been patient about it for at least 3 years. It was, Evelyn thought, looking at the shape of it, not unlike what had been done to her father. Larger in scale, more deliberate in execution, but the underlying mechanism was identical. Wait until people are vulnerable, approach them alone, make the unreasonable seem reasonable by presenting it as the only option. She said this. Halcott looked at her with something that had moved beyond assessment into something closer to respect. You've seen this before, he said. In a different form, she said. The principle is the same. Then you know how it ends. I know how it ends when people don't know what they're looking at, she said. I don't know yet how it ends when they do. She said it without false confidence because she had found that honest uncertainty was more useful than reassurance, and because she genuinely didn't know. But she knew the difference between having a chance and not having one, and today, around this table with a documented record and 2 additional witnesses who understood what they were facing, felt like having a chance. The sheriff arrived on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the meeting at Halcott's, and he was not what she had hoped for and not as bad as she had feared, which had become her standard measure of things. His name was Warren Call, a lean, methodical man in his 50s who had the patient eyes of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know that almost every situation was more complicated than the first account of it suggested. He spent the first day at the ranch, going through Evelyn's ledger and Rowan's parallel records with the careful attention of a man who understood documentation, asking questions that were specific and unhurried, and occasionally went in directions she hadn't anticipated. On the second day, he went to Halcott's. On the third, to Margaret Reed. He came back on the 4th day with a different expression, still methodical, still patient, but with something underneath it that was new. Your records are the best organized complaint I've received in 20 years, he told Rowan. Whoever put this together knew what they were doing. Rowan glanced at Evelyn, who was at the stove and had decided not to interject. Miss Ashcroft compiled most of it, Rowan said. Call looked at her with an expression that recalibrated something. You had prior experience with this kind of documentation? My father's situation, she said. I watched what happened when he didn't have records. I decided a long time ago not to make the same mistake. Call nodded slowly. The connection to Hargrove is going to be the harder piece to establish in a legal context, he said. Prentice's operation is sophisticated. They've kept the visible links thin. He paused. But the pattern you've documented, the timing, the sequence of acquisitions, the consistent methods used across different properties, that's harder to explain away than a single incident. Will it be enough? Rowan asked. To stop him acquiring more, possibly. To recover what's already been sold? Call shook his head. Those transactions were legal, whatever the circumstances surrounding them. The men and women who signed those papers signed them. The room held that truth for a moment. What about Fitch? Evelyn asked. Call looked at her. What about him? He's been providing information to Prentice's people, detailed information about operations in this valley that he could only have gathered through deliberate effort and deliberate sharing. She met his eyes. That's not gossip. That's something else. It may be, Call said carefully. It depends on what can be proved about the nature of the arrangement. Then that's what we work on next, she said. Rowan was looking at her with the quality of attention he brought to things that mattered to him. She did not look back at him directly. She was focused on Call. I'll need everything you have specifically on Fitch, Call said. Separate from the Prentice material. It'll be ready by tomorrow morning, Evelyn said. Call looked between them again with the careful assessment of someone resorting his understanding of a situation. He stayed for dinner, and over dinner he asked Evelyn about the medical work, and about the barn fire, and about Cass's arm, and she answered him plainly, and by the end of the meal she thought that whatever conclusions he had arrived at about who she was and what she was doing here were probably reasonably accurate. Call left the following morning with the copies she had prepared. The originals stayed in the locked desk, and the particular focused energy of a man who had arrived with one understanding of a situation and was leaving with a more complicated and more useful one. She stood on the porch and watched his wagon go, and Rowan stood beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. It's not over, he said. No, she agreed, not close to over. But it's different than it was 2 months ago. She looked at the road where Call's wagon had gone. It's different, she said. We're not alone in it anymore. That's the thing that changes first. He was quiet. The spring morning was coming into full light around them, the hills going green in a way that felt almost aggressive after the gray of winter. The kitchen garden showing the first tentative growth that she and Hector had been watching together every morning. I've been thinking, Rowan said. She waited. About the east pasture, he said, and she heard something in his voice that was choosing words with particular care. The ridge above it. There's a site there. My father looked at it once for a second house, before everything went wrong with the bank. He paused. The view from that ridge is the best on the whole property. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? He turned and looked at her directly, and the expression on his face was the one she had been seeing more often. The open quality, the absence of the careful layer he kept over most things. Because I've been thinking about building something on it, he said, and I've been thinking that I'd rather not build it alone. The morning air was cool and clear around them, and the ranch was beginning its daily sounds behind them. Horses, Dutch's voice from the direction of the barn, Tommy's boots on the gravel. And Evelyn stood on the porch of a house that was not hers and looked at the man standing beside her and thought about what he had just said and what he had not said, because the two things together were the actual message. She was not a woman who rushed toward things she wasn't sure of. She had made one decision in haste, or rather, one decision in desperation, and she had ended up on a train to Wyoming, which had turned out better than she deserved, but she was not prepared to rely on that kind of luck twice. Are you asking me something? She said. Not yet, he said. I'm telling you what I'm thinking. Those are different things. All right, she said slowly. I wanted you to know that's where my thinking is. He looked back at the hills, so that when I do ask, it's not a surprise. She thought about this. It was, she decided, the most Rowan Blackridge approach to the situation that was possible. Careful, honest, giving her time to think rather than requiring an immediate response, treating her like someone who deserved to make decisions from a position of knowledge rather than feeling. That's very considerate, she said. Her voice came out slightly uneven, which she noticed and could not fully prevent. I try to be, he said, without looking at her, and she thought she heard something in his voice that was not quite as steady as usual either. They stood there a moment longer. Then she went inside to start breakfast, because breakfast was real and immediate and required her attention, and she needed her attention on something she could manage while the rest of it settled into the part of her that would need some time to sort through what she felt. Prentice made his next move in May. She heard about it from Caldwell at the general store, who heard about it, inevitably, before anyone else. A man had come to Red Hollow representing a legal firm out of Cheyenne and had filed documents at the county clerk's office contesting the original title on Rowan's east pasture. The claim was that the land had been improperly recorded during his father's homestead period. A technical argument, Caldwell said, but legal challenges didn't have to win to be damaging. They only had to take long enough to cost more than the defendant could sustain. She carried the information back to the ranch in the wagon with the supplies and gave it to Rowan in the kitchen while the groceries were still on the table unpacked. His face went through several things in the space of a few seconds. She watched it, the initial impact of it, the calculation that followed immediately, and then the controlled settling that was the version of himself he chose to present to the rest of the world. The East Pasture, he said. Yes. That's where he'll try to start unraveling it. He sat down heavily, which was unusual. Rowan did not usually sit heavily. If he can create doubt about that title, he creates doubt about the whole filing history. The homestead records from that period they're not perfect. My father was not always careful about paperwork. Are the original documents available? In the county clerk's records. And I have copies. He looked up. But a legal challenge requires a response, and a response requires a lawyer, and the only lawyer in Red Hollow is Hargrove. Then we don't use Hargrove. She sat across from him. Call gave you a name in Mill Haven, the attorney he recommended. Deaver, Rowan said. Yes. I was already calculating. She could see it. The cost, the time, the logistics of 60 miles in each direction. It'll take weeks, months, maybe. Then it takes months, she said. Rowan. She waited until he looked at her. This is what Prentice is counting on, that the cost and the delay will wear you down, that you'll decide at some point that a fair offer is better than an unfair fight. She kept her eyes on his. Don't let him be right about that. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the May afternoon was doing what May afternoons do in Wyoming, being beautiful in a way that made it hard to remember there was anything wrong with the world. You're not afraid, he said. I'm afraid, she said. I'm afraid every other day. But being afraid doesn't mean being wrong about what needs to happen. What are you afraid of? He asked, and she heard in the question something genuine, not strategic curiosity, but real wanting to know. She thought about answering with something practical. She thought about deflecting with something about the ranch or Prentice. Then she decided that he had told her what he was thinking without being asked, and she owed him the same honesty. I'm afraid of building something here and then watching it come apart, she said. I've watched that happen before. I know how it feels, and I know how long it stays with you. She paused. I'm afraid of caring too much about something I can't guarantee. He was very still. That's an honest answer, he said quietly. I try to give those. He put his hands on the table, palms down, and looked at them for a moment in the way people do when they're saying something they haven't said before. I'm not going to let it come apart, he said. Not the ranch, and not... He stopped. Started again. There are things I'm more careful about losing than others. She held his gaze and didn't look away. Write to Deaver, she said. Today, while everything is clear in your mind, I'll help you draft it. He nodded. She got the writing paper. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had sat through winter nights with the ledger and the cold coffee and the accumulated weight of things that needed managing. And she helped him find the words, and he wrote them, and by the time the letter was sealed, the afternoon light had gone long and amber through the kitchen window. She got up to start dinner. He stayed at the table with his hand on the sealed letter and said, Evelyn. She turned. When this is resolved, he said. When Prentice is dealt with and the title is confirmed and the legal piece is done. He paused. I'm going to ask you that question I said I wasn't asking yet. She looked at him in the amber light, this scarred, difficult, honest man at her kitchen table, with his hand on a letter they had written together to fight for something that was, she had slowly and entirely realized, hers as much as his. Oh, she said. Not yes. Not yet. But not far from it, and they both knew it. She turned back to the stove, and he picked up his letter and went to find Dutch, and the ranch moved into evening around them both, carrying them forward in the particular way that time moves when you are building something real. Not fast, not smooth, but with the stubborn accumulating weight of things that intend to last. Deaver came from Mill Haven in the third week of May. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the slightly impatient energy of a competent man who had more work than hours. He reviewed the documentation she had prepared with the focused attention of someone who appreciated organized information, and when he looked up from the ledger, he looked at her rather than Rowan. You compiled this, he said. Most of it. Rowan contributed the entries he had direct knowledge of. Deaver looked back at the ledger. In a legal context, your documentation protocol is better than what I typically see from attorneys twice your age. He set it down. This is going to be useful, Rowan said, almost casually. She's useful generally. Deaver glanced at him with the expression of a man recalibrating a social situation. Evelyn decided to let whatever conclusion he reached stand on its own, and asked him instead about the specific grounds for the title challenge. The meeting with Deaver lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, they had a strategy. The title challenge could be countered directly using the original homestead filing records, which Rowan had. His father had been careless about many things, but he had kept the land records, she thought perhaps because the land was the one thing he had never been confused about wanting. Deaver would handle the legal response. More importantly, the pattern of Prentice's acquisitions, documented as they were, gave grounds for a broader investigation into whether the Cheyenne firm was operating in compliance with territorial regulations regarding land consolidation. That's a slower path, Deaver said, but it has wider impact. We're not the only ones he's done this to, Evelyn said. We're just the ones who kept records. Deaver looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. Would you be willing to serve as a witness to the documentation process itself? In a formal legal context, if it comes to that? Yes, she said, without hesitating. Rowan looked at her. She felt it. Yes, she said again, more quietly, because she meant it, and she wanted that to be clear. She had come to Wyoming looking for something to stand on. She had found it. She was not going to stand to the side of it now when it required defending. The evening after Deaver left, Rowan found her in the kitchen garden, working in the last of the light. The garden had come fully alive by now. Hector's careful planning and her own investment in it had produced a space that was genuinely productive and that she had come to feel was as much hers as anything she had ever owned. Rowan stood at the edge of it for a moment before coming in, which was his way of asking permission, she had realized, which was also his way of acknowledging it was hers. He came and stood beside her and looked at what had grown since October. You said yes immediately, he said, to Deaver, about testifying. I know. Most people would have hesitated. I'm not most people. He looked sideways at her with something in his expression that was quiet and certain in the way of something that has been decided over time rather than in a moment. No, he said, you're not. The light was going soft and low across the hills, and the garden smelled of turned earth and the green-specific smell of growing things. And Evelyn thought that of all the unexpected places she had ended up in her life, this one, this particular piece of ground, in this particular failing light, beside this particular difficult and honest man, was the one that felt most like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not say it. It was too large to say in the garden in the evening, but she thought it and she let herself think it, and that was enough for now. Deaver's response to the title challenge was filed in the last week of May, and then the waiting began. This was the part no one told you about when you were in the middle of a fight, that after the documents were written and the letters were sent, and the lawyer had ridden back to Millhaven with his briefcase and his wire-rimmed glasses and his competent, impatient energy, there was simply the ordinary life of the ranch continuing around you while somewhere in a county clerk's office, a man you had never met read papers that would determine a significant portion of your future. The cattle still needed tending. The kitchen garden needed watering. Dutch's burns had healed to the point where he had stopped allowing her to look at them, which she took as his version of being fully recovered. Cass's arm had knitted correctly. The doctor had confirmed it on his second visit with the satisfied tone of a man whose work had gone the way it was supposed to. And he was back to full duty with only a slight stiffness in cold mornings that he refused to mention and that she noticed anyway. Life, in other words, continued. It always did. That was both the comfort and the difficulty of it. Evelyn had thought the waiting would be the hardest part. She discovered instead that it was clarifying. When you could not act on a problem, when the problem had been handed to someone else who was better equipped to handle that specific piece of it, what remained was simply the life you were living and the question of whether you were living it honestly. She was. She had become certain of that somewhere in the accumulated months of this place, in the early mornings and the long winter evenings, and the conversations at the kitchen table that had begun as practical exchanges and become something else gradually, the way rivers change course, not suddenly, but irresistibly, over time, until one day you look up and realize the water is running somewhere it was not running before. She was in love with Rowan Blackridge. She had known it with complete certainty since the evening in the garden when she had thought, "This is where I am supposed to be." She had not said it to him. He had told her he would ask his question when things were resolved, and she had told him all right, and they had both been holding to that unspoken agreement with the discipline of two people who have learned the hard way that good things need the right conditions to last. But the waiting made her think about it more than she wanted to. It had a way of bringing the important things to the surface when the urgent things quieted. The letter from Deaver arrived on a Wednesday morning in June. She was in the kitchen when Rowan brought it in. She knew from his face before he opened it, not the outcome, but the importance of it, the particular quality of attention he gave it. She set down what she was doing and waited. He read it. Then he read it again, which told her the first reading had surprised him. "The title challenge was dismissed," he said. She exhaled. "On what grounds?" "The original homestead filing was found to be complete and properly recorded." He looked up from the letter. "Deaver says the firm in Cheyenne withdrew their challenge before the formal hearing. He thinks they were advised that the broader investigation into Prentice's pattern of acquisitions had made their position more visible than they wanted it to be." "Prentice backed down," she said. "For now." Rowan's voice was careful. "Deaver says Prentice himself is under investigation by the Territorial Land Office. Two of the ranchers who sold, they've come forward to say the terms they were told verbally were different from what was in the documents they signed." He paused. "It won't undo the sales, but it may stop him from making more." She leaned against the counter. The morning was bright through the kitchen window, the garden fully green beyond the glass, and she felt the weight of what they had carried through the winter and the spring shift slightly. Not disappear, because these things never disappeared cleanly, but reorganize into something more manageable. "What about Fitch?" she asked. Rowan set the letter on the table. "Call has enough to question him formally. Whether it goes further than questioning depends on what Fitch chooses to do." He paused. Men like Gerald tend to cooperate when the alternative becomes real enough. "And Hargrove?" "He resigned from the town council last week." He said it flatly, without satisfaction. Quietly. No explanation given. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove on the boardwalk in October, that rehearsed smile, the women standing in a configuration designed to stop her in her tracks. She thought about what it cost people to arrange themselves around a man like Hargrove and then discover what he actually was. That was its own damage, separate from everything else. "Is it enough?" she asked. "For Morrison and the others who didn't come forward?" "For some of them," Rowan said. "Morrison, I don't know. He's proud and he'll take a long time to admit he was wrong to shut the door." He picked up the letter again, looked at it. "But his land is safe. Whatever his reasons for staying out of it, he benefits from what we did." He was quiet for a moment. "That's all right. It usually works that way. Most of the people who benefit from a fight don't fight in it." She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "Sometimes," he said, "less than it used to." He looked at her directly, with the open quality that had become, over these months, simply how he looked at her. "I've had better company through this one than most." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Is this resolved enough?" He understood immediately what she was asking. She saw it in his face, the flicker of recognition, and underneath it something that was not composed at all, something that had been waiting a long time to not be composed. "I'll need to ride out to the east pasture this afternoon," he said carefully, "to check the fence line on the ridge." "I'll come with you," she said, just as carefully. He nodded once, like this was practical, like it was a matter of logistics. She turned back to the kitchen, and he went out to the morning work, and neither of them said anything else, and the whole house seemed to hold something it had been holding for a long time, waiting for the afternoon. The ridge above the east pasture was everything Stills had described in his indirect way, and everything she had imagined from Rowan's one mention of it in the spring. The land dropped away on three sides into the long green valley of the ranch, the Ridge Creek visible in two places as it moved south, the hills beyond it rolling out to the edge of what could be seen. The sky above was the enormous Wyoming sky, the kind that makes you understand why people who have lived under it cannot fully settle anywhere that the sky is smaller. They stood at the top of it in the June afternoon, the horses behind them, the wind moving through the grass with a sound that was the quietest sound she knew. There were stakes in the ground. She saw them when she looked, 4 of them, marking a rectangle, placed with care. She looked at them for a moment without speaking. "You already staked it," she said, "a few weeks ago." He was standing beside her looking at the valley. "I wanted to see how it sat." "How does it sit?" "Right," he said. "It sits right." She looked at the stakes. She looked at the valley. She thought about October, the train platform, the 4-sentence note, the weight of her trunk on the uneven plank. She thought about the kitchen at 6 in the morning and the ledger at midnight and Dutch's stoic face while she cleaned his burns, and Stills telling stories by lamplight, and Hector's wordless companionship in the garden, and Tommy Briggs arriving every morning with the absolute inability to be anyone other than exactly himself. She thought about all the things she had not expected, and all the things she had not been, and all the ways this place had slowly and without her permission become the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. "Ask me," she said. He turned and looked at her. The afternoon light was in his face, in the silver at his temples, on the scar that had long since stopped being the first thing she saw when she looked at him. He was 41 years old, and he had bought his land back from a bank with $140 and had stepped in for a stranger outside a saloon in Cheyenne and had written supply costs on a list for a woman he had just met because he understood that she would want to know. And he was standing on a ridge with 4 stakes in the ground, looking at her with the expression of a man who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long road. "Evelyn Ashcroft," he said, "will you stay? Not as my housekeeper, not as my employee." He paused. "As my wife, my partner in this place." Another pause, shorter. "My equal in everything we build here." She had thought she would need a moment. She had thought the size of it would require some space to absorb. Instead, she found that she had already absorbed it, somewhere between October and June, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days that had turned out to be anything but ordinary. "Yes," she said. He looked at her like he was making sure he had heard it correctly. She looked back at him with the steady, clear-eyed certainty of a woman who had earned the right to this particular yes through everything it had cost her to arrive at it. "Yes," she said again, because she wanted him to be sure. He stepped forward and he put his hands on her face, rough hands, working hands, honest hands. And he kissed her once, in the June afternoon on the ridge above everything they were going to build, and it was not a perfect moment. The wind was too strong and she had dirt on her from the garden, and he had been in the saddle for 2 hours, and the horses behind them were restless, and one of them stamped and blew impatiently. It was an imperfect moment, in an imperfect place, in an imperfect year, and she would not have changed a single element of it. They rode back down to the ranch in the early evening, and she told no one that night except the space of her own room and the dark ceiling above her bed, and she lay there and felt the particular quality of happiness that comes not from everything being perfect, but from everything being true. And she let herself feel it fully, without qualification, because she had not always had the safety to do that, and she understood that it was not something to waste. In the morning, she told the kitchen first, which is to say she told Stills, who was there early as he often was, nursing his knee by the warmth of the stove. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "About time." "You knew?" "Everybody knew," he said. "Everybody's known since about December." He picked up his coffee. "We were waiting for you two to figure it out." She stared at him. "December. Dutch had it figured by November." Stills was looking into his coffee with the expression of a man keeping his amusement carefully contained. "Tommy knew by Christmas. Hector, he doesn't say much, but he started tending that garden like it mattered by February, so..." She sat down at the kitchen table. "Nobody said anything." "Nobody's business," Stills said simply. "And besides, some things you have to let people get to themselves. You push, you ruin it." He looked at her with the old, weathered eyes that had seen a lot of things and remembered most of them. "He's better with you here," he said, plainly, without sentiment. "Not softer, better. There's a difference." She thought about the man she had met on the platform in October, contained, careful, giving nothing away, and the man who had stood on the ridge yesterday with his hands on her face. Not softer, better. Yes, that was accurate. "Thank you, Stills," she said, "for everything this year. for sitting on that doorstep and talking to me when I needed it." He waved his hand in the dismissive way of someone who does not want to be thanked for the things that mattered to him. "You needed to know about the place," he said. "Seemed practical." She smiled. She got up and made breakfast. The wedding was in September, a year almost to the month from when she had stepped off the train with her trunk and her $42 and her grandmother's quilt. They held it on the ranch, not in town, which was a decision she and Rowan made together without much discussion, because they both understood that this place was theirs and that what was theirs should start here. Halcott came with his wife, who turned out to have the warmth the meeting around her dining table had not fully revealed. Margaret Reed came, and she and Evelyn stood together before the ceremony in the way of women who have been through something real alongside each other, not talking much, not needing to. Caldwell came from town. The doctor who had set Cass's arm came. Call sent a letter that arrived the week before, short and congratulatory, in the formal style of a man more comfortable with legal language than personal expression, and she read it twice and appreciated it. Dutch wore his good coat and stood in the back and watched the whole thing with his arms crossed and his expression exactly as unreadable as always. And when she caught his eye at one point, he gave her the small, definite nod that was Dutch, for this is right and I approve. It was the same nod he had given her on her first day when Rowan had told him to show her the same respect he showed him. A year later, it meant something different. A year later, it meant everything. Tommy cried during the ceremony and spent considerable effort pretending he hadn't. Hector stood beside him with the grave, careful expression of a man who was also moved and had no intention of showing it, which was fine, because Evelyn knew by now that Hector's silences were not empty. Gerald Fitch was not there. Gerald Fitch had in the end cooperated with Call's investigation to the extent of confirming what they already knew in exchange for the legal matter being handled quietly. He had sold his property in Red Hollow 6 weeks after the formal inquiry concluded and left for somewhere that no one in the valley had particular knowledge of, and he had done it in the specific way of men who know they have made themselves too small for the space they were occupying. No one said his name at the wedding. There was nothing to say. Evelyn wore a dress she had made herself over the summer months. Not her grandmother's quilt, which was on her bed where it belonged, but fabric she had chosen with care, in a color that was neither white nor gray, but something between them that suited the woman she was rather than the woman she had been at 20. She had cut it to her own measurements and sewn it with the precision she brought to clothes work, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror in her room the morning of the wedding, she thought, "This is what it looks like when you make something exactly right for yourself." Rowan was waiting for her on the porch when she came out, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her on the ridge, like a man who has arrived somewhere after a long road and is not going to pretend he doesn't know what that means. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked together to where the small gathering was waiting in the morning sun, and the ceremony was plain and honest and exactly what they were. The house on the ridge was finished the following spring. It had taken longer than planned. The winter was hard again, and the materials had been delayed twice, and Rowan had refused to cut corners on the foundation, which she had supported completely because she had watched what happened when people cut corners, and she was not interested in that particular lesson. She had been involved in every decision: the size of the kitchen windows, the depth of the porch, the placement of the room that would serve as a study where the ledgers and the records would live in proper order. It was built from the ground up, as he had said on the platform in October when everything began, without the history of his parents or anyone else's choices embedded in its walls. It was theirs in the way that only a thing made from the beginning belongs to the people who made it. They walked through it the day it was complete, just the two of them, in the late afternoon light that came through those large kitchen windows and laid itself across the new floor in long gold pieces. She ran her hand along the kitchen counter. He stood in the doorway of the study and looked at the empty shelves, and she knew he was thinking about the ledger, about everything that would eventually fill those shelves, records and correspondence, and the accumulated evidence of a life managed with intention. "It's not finished," he said. "No," she agreed. "That's the right kind of not finished." He looked at her across the empty room. She looked back at him, 42 years old, and she was standing in a house she had helped build on a ridge in Wyoming that no one had told her she would ever stand on, and the life spread out behind her like a road you only understand when you turn and look at the distance you've covered, All those October mornings and February nights and April meetings around other people's tables and the garden and the ledger and the long conversations over cold coffee. And she thought, I did not become this person despite what happened to me. I became this person because of what I chose to do with it. That was the thing no one told you, not the version of the story that gets told in towns where a woman was humiliated and a good man rescued her and they lived well. That story was smaller than the truth. The truth was that she had rescued herself in the way that mattered, not from the circumstances, because circumstances don't always yield, but from the temptation to become defined by them. She had arrived in Wyoming with nothing but the discipline not to let a 4-sentence note be the last word on who she was. Everything else had come from that. Rowan crossed the room and stood beside her at the kitchen window, looking out at the valley below. The ranch visible in the middle distance, the Ridge Creek moving south the way it always moved, the hills holding their position at the edge of everything. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me. The day I saw you on the platform, he said, when Crane gave you that note. He paused, and she heard in the pause the careful weight of something he had not said before. I had been watching you before that, from inside the store. You came off that train, and you had the look of a woman who was managing something difficult and not willing to let it show. And I thought, he stopped again. I thought, whoever that is, she came a long way to be treated like that, and it isn't right. She was quiet. That was all it was, he said. At the time. He was looking at the valley, not at her. I didn't know anything else yet, just that it wasn't right. She understood what he was giving her with this. He was telling her that the beginning was honest, that he had not acted from attraction or calculation or anything other than the plain sense that a wrong was occurring and he was in a position to address it. She had always believed this, but there was a difference between believing something and being told it directly, and the difference mattered. Thank you for telling me, she said. He looked at her then. Thank you for staying. She held his gaze and thought about all the forms that staying had taken, staying through the winter, staying through Prentice, staying through the slow and complicated process of two people learning to trust each other, staying through the fear of caring too much about something she couldn't guarantee. I stayed because it was worth staying for, she said. You and this place both. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it in the simple, unglamorous way of people who have been through enough together that ease has replaced effort, and they stood at the window of their house and looked at their valley in the afternoon light and said nothing else for a while, because nothing else was needed. The years that followed were not easy. They were not meant to be. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the particular difficulties of building something in a place that does not accommodate carelessness. There were disagreements, real ones, the kind that come when two people with strong views share responsibility over important things, and neither of them was the sort to capitulate without being genuinely persuaded. There were losses. Stills's knee finally won its long argument with him, and he retired to a small house in Red Hollow that Rowan helped him find and Evelyn helped him outfit, and she visited him there often enough that the visits became expected and then necessary, because he had become something she did not have a clean word for. Not family exactly, but not family. He died 4 years after the wedding, on a Tuesday morning in winter, and she felt the specific weight of losing someone who had known who you were before you fully knew it yourself. Cass's arm gave him trouble in cold weather for the rest of his time on the ranch, which he managed with the stoic practicality of a man who has decided that the alternative, not having the use of the arm at all, is the only relevant comparison. Dutch remained Dutch, which is to say he remained essential and difficult and deeply reliable. And she had by the 5th year achieved the thing she had worked toward from the first, his genuine respect, which looked from the outside almost exactly like his ordinary behavior, but which she could read the difference in, and which mattered to her more than she had initially expected. Tommy Briggs eventually became a man, though it took longer than most things take and went sideways a few times in the process, as Tommy's things tended to do. He left the ranch at 23 to try mining and came back at 26 with enough experience of the world to have become, finally, someone who thought before he spoke. Mostly. The school that Evelyn established in Red Hollow in the 3rd year of their marriage was the thing the town remembered her for longest. She had proposed it to Rowan one evening the way she proposed most things to him, directly, with the information already organized. There were 43 children in the valley without access to consistent education. A building could be built on the northeast edge of town for reasonable cost. A teacher could be hired from Denver if the salary was competitive. She and Rowan could fund the first year. After that, it needed to be community supported. He had listened to all of it and said, "All right, that was all." They built it the following spring. What she had not anticipated was how much the school would change the conversation about who she was in Red Hollow. Not because she had been trying to change it. She had stopped managing other people's opinions somewhere around the previous February and found her life considerably lighter for it, but because something about a school was different from everything else. You could dismiss a woman who managed a ranch house, even manage one extraordinarily well. You could dismiss a woman who kept records and helped win a legal fight. But it was harder to dismiss a woman who built a school for your children, because children are the specific vulnerability that communities cannot protect through cynicism. And the people of Red Hollow knew, whether they said it or not, that their children's lives would be different because of something she had done. Mrs. Hargrove sent a note of thanks in the school's second year. Evelyn read it and set it aside and did not respond with the elaborate courtesy she would have managed a year earlier, because she had learned that elaborate courtesy in the direction of someone who had not deserved it was its own kind of dishonesty. She sent back a short, genuine note saying she was glad the school was useful, and that was the extent of it, and she felt entirely settled in that choice. On a September evening, 11 years after she had first arrived in Wyoming, Evelyn sat on the porch of the house on the ridge and watched the light go from gold to orange to the particular blue-gray of a fall dusk over the valley. The ranch below was going through its end-of-day sounds. Horses, the distant voice of one of the hands, the dogs settling. Rowan was somewhere in the south pasture and would be back before dark because he always was. Their daughter, 7 years old and possessed of an absolute inability to be still, was inside somewhere making noise that suggested she was engaged in something creative or destructive, possibly both. Their son, who was 4, and took after Rowan in the specific way of children who have decided to replicate the most challenging characteristics of a parent, was asleep already, which was the mercy of the evening. She sat with her coffee going cold in her hands. She had inherited that from him, the cold coffee habit, which he found privately satisfying in a way he was not entirely above mentioning. And she watched the valley and thought about October. It was a thing she did sometimes, not with grief or regret, but with the kind of attention you give to the moments that turned out to matter. The platform. The note. The walk across the street with her trunk catching on the loose plank. The man in the doorway who had said, "I don't expect you to do anything with it." 11 years ago, she had stood in a strange town with $42 and no particular future, and she had chosen, in the space of about 4 minutes, to trust an unknown man because his eyes were honest and his offer was real. She had spent the years since discovering that trust given to the right person does not diminish you. It asks things of you, patience and honesty, and the willingness to be seen clearly. But it asks those things in exchange for something equally real. Partnership. Shared weight. The specific safety of being known by someone who stays. She heard the horse before she saw him, the familiar sound of Rowan coming up the ridge road in the end-of-day light. He came around the corner and saw her on the porch, and the particular thing that happened in his face when he saw her. The thing that had been happening for 11 years and had not become ordinary. She saw it from 20 yards away, and it still did to her what it had always done, which was settle something in her chest that the rest of the day had moved around. He put up the horse and came to the porch and sat beside her, and she handed him her coffee because it was cold anyway, and he would drink it, and he drank it, and they sat together in the blue-gray dusk and listened to the valley below them and the sounds of their children inside the house. "How's the south fence?" she asked. "Needs work on the corner post," he said. "I'll take Hector tomorrow." "Hector's going into town tomorrow. His granddaughter." "Right." He adjusted. "I'll take Cass. Cass's arm will complain about the cold." "Cass's arm always complains about the cold." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll take him anyway. He'll complain less about it than he'll complain about being left behind." She smiled. He was right about that. They sat. The first stars were showing up in the east, the sky doing the thing it always did out here, the thing she had never gotten used to, had never wanted to get used to, becoming enormous and deep and full of more light than any city sky could hold. Her daughter appeared at the window behind them, pressed her face against the glass, made a face, disappeared. Neither of them said anything about it. "Do you ever think about how it started?" she asked. It was the same question she had been sitting with before he came home, the October thinking, and she said it without preamble because after 11 years, preamble was largely unnecessary between them. He considered it. "Sometimes," he said. "The platform. Crane handing you that note." "I was trying not to cry," she said, "in case you ever wondered." "I knew you were," he said. "That was part of it." She looked at him. "You were holding yourself together in a place where you had every right to fall apart," he said. That told me something. She had never known this. 11 years, and she had never known this was what he had seen. What did it tell you? That whatever you were not someone who needed rescuing, he said. Which meant if you accepted my offer, you'd be accepting it because it made sense, not because you had no other choice. He paused. I needed to know that, for my own reasons. She understood immediately what he meant by his own reasons. The man who had bought his land back with $140, who had made his way alone for a long time, who needed to know that the people in his life were there by genuine choice rather than desperation. She had always understood this about him, but understanding it and hearing him say it were different. It made sense, she said. It also turned out to be much more than it made sense for. She looked at him. But it started with the sense of it. That was the honest part. He nodded slowly. That's how the good things start, he said. With the honest part. She looked back at the valley and the sky and the stars coming out in greater numbers now, and she thought that this was what she would have wanted to tell the woman on the platform, if she could go back and find her standing there with her trunk and her $42 and her 4-sentence note. Not that it would be easy, not that she would find a perfect life or a perfect man or that the road would be smooth, because none of those things were true. But that worth and ease were not the same thing. That the life you built with your own hands and your own mind and your own stubborn refusal to let a single bad morning define you, that life had a weight to it, a substance, that the life you were handed never quite matched, and that somewhere in Wyoming there was a ridge with a view worth standing on, and that the man beside you, imperfect, difficult, honest, yours, would still be there in the morning. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had simply needed the courage to find out. The dusk deepened around them, and the stars took over the sky, and somewhere inside the house, her daughter started singing something loud and tuneless that bore no resemblance to any known song, and Rowan made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he usually got, and Evelyn leaned her shoulder against his and looked at the valley that was theirs and felt, with complete and complicated and imperfect certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.